Hello, this is Dr. Reynolds again, and this is my presentation on marriage and family in the first half of the 19th century. I need to get the PowerPoint slides up, and then we can begin. First off, I want to talk about the concept of separate spheres. The introduction to your textbook talked about this, and it's an important concept for understanding, in a sense, the ideal of marriage. You remember from the lecture or presentations on ideas about gender, science and medicine, that we had gotten to the point of there being two genders, right? And the idea being then that as separate types of people, men and women were naturally endowed with certain, I don't want to say not, certain rights, but certain spheres of importance. And the idea that, men were in the public sphere, women in the private, and so on and so forth. And there are various names of this. The ideology of separate spheres is one. The cult of true womanhood is another, if you're focusing on women. Victorian morality is also a way that this has been described. So, according to the authors of your textbook, this view of gender, quote, treated men and women as complete and absolute opposites with almost no common human traits that transcended the differences of gender. The ideology of true womanhood also saw the larger society as carved into complementary but mutually exclusive spheres of public and private concerns, work and home life, politics and family. So, what did this idea then come to mean? Women, of course, were in charge, or were in the private sphere, in the domestic sphere, the arena of home, family, children. And so it was assumed, or was argued, that women were thus, naturally nurturing, hence, that the highest calling a woman could reach was that of mother. And home, was where she shone. Home was to be a safe, clean, moral haven of domestic tranquility, and the wife / mother, whom one English poet referred to as the angel in the house, kept it that way. And this was for the benefit of their husbands, who had to work and struggle in the public world of business, politics, and so forth. So marriage was about more than just the happiness or the emotional needs of two people, and more than about the economics of marriage. Marriage becomes seen as important as much for meeting the emotional needs of the husband and wife as it was about material goods and making a living. Keep in mind, though, that especially for the well-to-do, money and issues of who brought how much to the marriage were still very important. As I've mentioned, the key role then for women was that of mother, the selfless caregiver who sees to the needs of her family and to that of her servants, the members of her household. So we have here, for example, an illustration from 1850, where we have, mama with the baby in her lap, and brother and sister reading together quietly, and everything's serene and well managed. A variation on this, on the whole idea of motherhood that emerges in America, is known as Republican motherhood. And I'm not sure if this was a term that was used at the time or if it's something that historians have used, but it was the idea that one of the things that in a republic where you do not have a king or queen, it is indeed the mother's task in part to raise her sons, especially, to be good citizens when they become adults. So it is, part of a good mother's obligation to make sure that her son is public-minded, he's a godly man, and of course that her daughters were taught to be properly submissive and domestic. This then feeds into another idea that women were naturally teachers, particularly of small children, the very young, and why increasingly over the 19th century, elementary education becomes the provenance of women. Okay, so women were supposed to be keepers of the home, supposed to be mothers. They were also supposed to be religious. Women were held to be more naturally pious, more interested in spiritual and religious matters than men. And in the first half of the 19th century, particularly in the 1830s and 40s, we have the context of something known as the Second Great Awakening. Those of you who are familiar with American history may remember or have a vague memory of the First Great Awakening was in the 1740s and involved John Wesley and, I'm just blanking on his name. But the Methodist preachers as well as Americans. So this Second Great Awakening in the 1830s and 40s is another kind of explosion of religious interest. And the country was swept by religious revivals that attracted people to what today we might call the evangelical forms of Christianity. Revivals were especially popular amongst Methodists and Baptists. One of the things, of course, that marked Methodists and Baptists out from, say, more traditional establishment churches like Episcopalians or Catholics was that they thought, or they allowed common people, just regular Joe Blows, to be preachers and to be leaders of congregations. They didn't have to have any particularly formal seminary education or be ordained by a bishop or things like that. And so, these lay preachers, would hold these outdoor meetings and would preach to the crowds and encourage people to repent of their sins and turn to God. It is also in the 1830s and 40s, especially in upstate New York, that we see the emergence of new forms of religion, including the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or more colloquially known as the Mormons. In fact, Central and Western New York State became so renowned for its revivals that it became known as the burnt over district, that there was a kind of almost too much religious revivalism. Women were very involved in these revivals and in the spread of these new faiths, and you can see in the drawing here that we've got the two women standing at the back on the right hand side of the photo, or excuse me, the drawing, and women are in the audience very clearly with their bonnets. This religious excitement and fervor also helped to uphold another part of the cult of true womanhood, which is the idea of sexual purity, that one is refrains from sex until marriage, and that even within marriage, sex is not something that women were supposed to be particularly interested in, except in that it led to having children. And in the earlier period, when I had talked about the idea of the one-sex theory, like in the 17th century, early 18th century, there actually was the idea that because women were closer to nature, they were more sexually voracious than men, and that they were the problem in terms of drawing men away from purity. But by the 19th century, women are seen increasingly as closer to the divine, and therefore were not sullied by sexual passion. It also meant that for middle and upper class women, well, probably more so middle class women, they went into their marriages knowing very little about sex. I don't know, it's hard to speculate on what that meant for a young woman on her wedding night. Here is a representation again of the mother as teacher. Oh, and another of the new religious communities that emerged in the 1830s and 40s were the Shakers. Now, they had actually been around since the 18th century, but they began to attract a great deal more members, and they set up more than one community, again, several of them in upstate New York. And what distinguished them and what they got their name from was that they danced, right? And this is a representation of their religious dancing. They lived in community, but with very distinct division between men and women. And in fact, they didn't believe in sex, which then made it hard, of course, in that they didn't have any children. And so the question of how do you get new members, they began adopting orphans. And of course, it is the white bridal gown that comes to symbolize the purity of a young woman as she goes into marriage. Queen Victoria was the one who made this fashionable. She was married in 1840 to Prince Albert, and she wore white. And of course, the fashion, the royal family as fashion setters was certainly there. All right, so this was the ideal woman. Women in marriage were in the domestic sphere, men were in the public sphere, in the dog-eat-dog world of business. Women were naturally drawn to be, were naturally mothers, and part of that role was as a teacher, and of course as a caretaker of the physical and social and religious needs of her family. So that's the ideal. When we start asking the question of, well, did the ideal match the reality? There's a bit more of a mix here. First of all, keeping house in the 19th century was hard work. Remember, we're talking about before electricity, before piped water in homes for the most part. Although in this picture, I'm not sure what's the date on this is. She's got spigots in her kitchen. But I have the diaries of my grandmother, who was a farmer's wife, and her diaries go from 1915 to the 1950s. And the life she describes is very hard in terms of having to preserve food and worrying about the farm and the daily tasks of cooking cleaning. Mondays were wash days, even in the wintertime. And water had to be hauled from spigots or from wells or pumps. And so the ideal of the mother at home and the father at work presumes that the father makes enough money to support the entire family, that the husband is the sole breadwinner, and employers thus justified paying young women who were working, justified paying them less because they argued, well, women were not family, we're not supporting the families. They were working for, just a little few extra, dollars in their pocket, or so-called pin money. And so that women did not have to be paid a living wage. Of course, if you were single or widowed, or your husband deserted you or whatever, or if you're, it made it difficult, because women generally made about half or 2/3 of what men did. So this kind of, ideal world of, mom at home, dad at work, and the kids, being carefully educated, is not the reality for a lot of people. It certainly is not possible for farm families like my grandmother, even though she's a bit later in time. The work of all of the family members was needed on family farms. Factory, urban working families also needed the income from everybody's labor. There were families where the woman was the head of the household. And so, how are you going to keep body and soul together if she can't make more than half of what a man would make? So in most families, when we think about the broad sweep of American society, needed the labor of both mother and father, and to a certain extent of children, even if it was only labor in the home as opposed to, but working in factories. But this is where child labor came from, is because it was needed. It was a necessity. And if the family wanted to try and get ahead, to try and move up the social scale a bit, the path or the way to do that would be to try and get your eldest son well educated, and then he could move into a white collar job or a profession. So girls and women, and we'll see this in Lowell, for example, girls and women were often sent to work for their families in order to fund their brother's education, because school, of course, is not free for much of the 19th century. All right. Well, what also begins to happen is that even with this ideal that supposedly women are in the domestic sphere and are to care for those in the home, the ideal of the cult of true womanhood meant that women were supposedly naturals at nursing the sick, teaching children. It was their Christian duty to care for the poor and oppressed, and their Christian duty to help spread the gospel. So we begin to see women moving into the public sphere as an extension of some of these kinds of roles, so that women begin to take an interest in and sponsor hospitals and clinics. We see the movement of women into the profession of teaching, as I mentioned, especially into elementary education. The so others took on charity work in the urban settings of the slums and the caring for the poor. So And women also became involved in religious outreach, including overseas missions. Some of the new, communities like the Shakers and the Oneida community, the Amana community. There was also some kind of utopian communities in New Harmony, Indiana. And they were described as utopian, the idea that they could somehow create a better life or better world for people in their separate community. These often, moving into one of these communities often meant that you were challenging the traditional roles, like the Shakers, went so far as to say no sex, and that, they didn't have marriage at all. Others went the other way, and we have people who advocated free love and that you should be able to sleep around, and and nobody would be any the worse for it. Women were strong supporters of charity and of church missions. Some of them eventually go into the mission field and go out into wilderness and strange places. One of the first women into the Oregon and Northwest territories was Nerissa Whitman, a wife of a Methodist minister. Some wives ended up going to places like Africa and elsewhere. And women could claim, and again, that they were not in any way being, masculine in their behavior in doing these things. But to be seen in public, even if you were doing good works, was a slippery slope. In doing this work, a lot of women start to become aware of how it was that law and custom and politics could influence their ability to do things like teach the poor or care for the sick. And so women start to become involved with and become very visible in reform movements. Probably the most famous one, and I'll talk more about it in my next presentation about gender and law, was the abolitionist movement, the movement to end slavery. But like in England, for example, I tend to know English history a little better, there was a woman named Elizabeth Fry, who was a Quaker, who was looking for some good work to do and decided to visit women who were in prison or actually in jail being held for trial or held for punishment in a place called Newgate in London. And it was, of course, a cesspool. And so she took it on herself to take the lead in reforming and improving the conditions for women in prison. And became acknowledged as a kind of expert and testified before Parliament and things like that. So even with this ideology of the cult of true womanhood, women found ways and evolved into activities that took them into the public sphere, sometimes alongside men and sometimes with just women. But the separate spheres, again, the ideal, was that the husband would, loved his wife and cared for her and was, kind and considerate. And so things, though, were not always the case. Men were abusive and deserted their wives or beat them and so forth. And as the view of marriage changes into one that means, as the view of marriage changes to being about personal happiness, This also then changes the views on what's a reasonable reason for divorce. Now, to start out with, of course, in the colonial period, divorce just was not on the option list. In England, you had to get a private act of parliament passed and signed by the king or queen to get a divorce. So we know in Massachusetts, for example, the colony of Massachusetts Bay, there were 27 divorces in the period from the 1630, when they founded the colony, to the 1780s. So you're talking, 150 years, there were 27 divorces granted. In southern colonies, Georgia, south of the Carolinas, Virginia, divorce was not allowed at all. Even where divorce was allowed, often the parties were not allowed to remarry, and children usually ended up in the care of fathers, because just as the femme couvert, the woman who is covered by her husband, everything that is hers belongs to him. So that included the children. Often what people who could afford it would do was to seek formal separation, which the court recognized and required the husband to support his wife, but they were not technically divorced. They were still married. Well, once the United States becomes an independent nation, and as the Constitution gets implemented in 1788, marriage and family law was one of those areas that was left to the states. And so we get tremendous variation by state, or not tremendous, but certainly a degree of variation. And most states only allowed a divorce in cases of adultery and or cruelty. By the 1820s and 30s, reformers were beginning to argue that cruelty, desertion, drunkenness, and incompatibility should also be grounds for divorce. And the law starts to change in the 1830s. For example, in Connecticut, a law was passed that allowed a couple to divorce if any misconduct, quote, permanently destroys the happiness of the petitioner and defeats the purpose of the marriage relation, unquote. So you can see there that whole new idea of marriage as being about personal happiness, and so that if you're not happy, then you should not be made to keep being married to this person. As you can guess, though, that's a bit more of a loosey-goosey kind of argument, rather than adultery or cruelty. Still, the number of divorces is rising after the 1840s, and by the end of the Civil War, by 1867, there were at least 10,000 divorces in the United States in 1 year, which I think, if I remember right, may have been a world, the record for the world that year, but who knows. The other thing, of course, that changes as a result of changing views of marriage and the whole idea of women as naturally nurturing is that women are seen as the proper people to care for children, especially young children, so that in the cases of divorce, it becomes increasingly common for the children now, after mid-century, to be in the custody of their mothers. So the kind of family and marriage that I've been talking about is primarily a middle class or upper class experience. It didn't really apply necessarily to the lives of working and farming people. And of course, the African American experience of family and marriage in the United States is tremendously different. we are, of course, here talking about slavery and the way that marriage and family worked in the context of slavery. Slave marriages were usually not recognized as legal. But in spite of that, and in spite of the horrific conditions of living under slavery, African Americans managed to create and maintain families and family structures over distance and time in ways that took a great deal of effort and ingenuity. Of course, the great fear in the context of slave marriage and family is the fear of separation. 1 in 6 marriages of African American slaves were broken by one partner being sold away by the master of the plantation or the household. But still, slave families managed to maintain often, 2-parent families and took care of their kids to the best of their ability. Celebration of marriage, and to go back to the picture, which is supposedly what a slave marriage looked like, and you got the musicians here and the children here, and here's the bride and groom. When slaves got married, they were very conscious of the fact that this was risky. And so celebrations of marriage often included an acknowledgement of that. In the 1930s, the government sent people out to interview former slaves who were still alive, often in their old age. But one former slave noted, they never would say, "What God done join, can't no man pull asunder." And a slave preacher in Kentucky was known to marry couples with the benediction, "Until death or distance do you part." Right? And African American couples also often had to reside apart in that, particularly if the husband worked on one farm and the wife on another. In this part of the slave owning world, in Missouri, for example, you're not talking about plantation labor. You're talking about a household where there might be 2 or 3 enslaved people, often women and no men. So it was often could be a challenge. The uncertainty then, and of course the other risks of slavery are the vulnerability of women to sexual assault, and just the brutality of slavery itself, where slaves were at risk for being beaten, that they were fed, whether they were fed well or not, it was up to the master. Whether they were allowed to rest. There are stories of women having to have their babies brought out to them in the field so they could feed them. And so that they were still, having their babies at the breast, even though they were still working in the field. The fears of separation and and this is another custom, the idea of jumping the broom. And you may, if you've been at an African American wedding, you may have seen this. I saw it in a play once, but this was another symbol of the kind of informality of slave marriage. So African Americans came to rely heavily on extended kin networks. We know that families were broken and one of the statistics I came across is that we know that 10% of the enslaved sold in New Orleans were under the age of 12. So it's clear they're being, removed from their families. The idea of, that the father had the power and authority over the children and wife, and part of his responsibility was to protect his children and wife, was obviously not possible for African American men. But women, we know women began to have children around age 20 or 21, and often would have 6 or 7 children. How many of them lived to adulthood is another question. We have some numbers that show that about 1/3 of African American babies died before the age of 10, which in the 18th century would be similar to what you'd see in the peasant classes of France or continental Europe. One of the ways in which we know that family remains so important is that after the Civil War, African Americans went to great lengths to try and find members of their families. And we see this in newspaper ads and letters to others, or to government authorities or to former owners and this sort of thing. This is an example of an ad from a newspaper called The Appeal, and I think it was published in Richmond. And notice, so it says, "I wish to learn the whereabouts of my mother and my brothers and sisters, and also my half-brothers. I was owned by John Fairfax of Prince William County, Virginia, and last saw my mother in 1856. And she's writing in 1892. So it's kind of heartrending. So family life, the stark differences are between, the well-to-do white upper class and middle class families, both in the South and in the North, who could afford, in a sense, to have their women live lives of leisure.